There are stars whose brilliance dazzles the world, and then there are stars whose light cuts through the darkness with a beauty almost too fragile to last. Dorothy Dandridge belonged to the second kind. She stepped into Hollywood at a time when the rules were fixed, the boundaries unspoken but ironclad, and the doors of opportunity opened only halfway, if they opened at all. Yet she carried herself with the grace of someone determined to exist beyond limitations, as if she knew her presence alone was already rewriting a page of history. On stage, she was luminous. Her smile could shift the atmosphere of an entire room. Her voice, whether singing jazz or speaking a single line of dialogue, held a rhythm that felt timeless. Cameras adored her. Audiences couldn't look away. She was elegance, fire, softness, and defiance wrapped into one unforgettable figure, a woman who could turn a simple glance into a work of art. And still, the deeper truth of her life was far from what the spotlight suggested. Behind the glamour lived a woman who fought battles that rarely made headlines, battles shaped by the era she was born into, by the color of her skin, by a system that celebrated her beauty but resisted her talent, and by personal heartbreaks that no applause could erase. For every triumph, there was a quiet ache. For every standing ovation, a moment of solitude waiting backstage. Dorothy's story is not just the story of an actress. It is the story of a barrier breaker, a pioneer, and a woman whose courage carved a path for countless others. It is the story of how brilliance endures even when the world is not ready for it. And it begins long before the cameras ever found her. Long before Dorothy Dandridge became a symbol of elegance on the silver screen, she was a little girl navigating a world that rarely offered softness. Born on November 9, 1922 in Cleveland, Ohio, she entered life already marked by absence. Her father walked away before she took her first breath, leaving her mother, Ruby Dandridge, to carry the weight of survival alone. Ruby was an actress, talented, hard-working, and determined, but confined to the limited roles Hollywood allowed women of her race. Maids, servants, characters built to serve rather than shine. Dorothy grew up watching her mother act her heart out in roles that never reflected her worth. It was her first lesson in the quiet cruelty of the industry she would one day inherit. Ruby, knowing how unforgiving the world could be, prepared her daughters early. Dorothy and her older sister, Vivian, were taught to sing, dance, smile, and perform as if their futures depended on it, and in many ways, they did. Money came and went. The family moved constantly, drifting from one city to another, sometimes with little more than hope and rehearsal routines to cling to. The world outside their home was turbulent, but the stage became the closest thing to stability the sisters had. By the time Dorothy reached her early teens, she and Vivian were no longer just two girls with talent. Along with their friend Etta Jones, they formed the Dandridge sisters, a trio whose harmonies were smooth, youthful, and irresistible. They traveled across the country, performing in nightclubs, theaters, hotels, anywhere willing to offer a spotlight and a paycheck. The work was demanding, but Dorothy blossomed under the lights. Her poise was unusual for her age, her beauty undeniable even then. Their biggest break came at New York City's legendary Cotton Club, one of the most prestigious entertainment venues of the era. It was glamorous, extravagant, packed with powerful white patrons who came to watch black performers bring magic to the stage. Dorothy dazzled them all, but behind the velvet curtains lay a stark truth. The performers weren't allowed to sit in the audience, to dine in the same room, or to mingle with the people who applauded them. The rules were strict, unspoken, and humiliating. Dorothy learned that even in the places where she shined the brightest, she was still seen through the lens of segregation. That contradiction, brilliance embraced, humanity denied, etched itself into her memory. Yet the girl who carried that sting never let it extinguish her flame. She began to dream bigger. She wanted more than nightclub applause. She wanted to act, to bring characters to life, to be taken seriously in an industry that rarely allowed black women to be anything more than background figures. Hollywood was distant, complicated, and full of barriers, but Dorothy was already growing into someone who moved as if barriers were only temporary. Her childhood carved the core of who she would become: resilient, poised, endlessly determined. She had tasted both admiration and injustice before she was old enough to vote. She had learned to smile through exhaustion, to stand tall even when the world insisted she kneel, and to turn every performance into proof that she was meant for more. And somewhere between the long bus rides, the smoky stages, and the applause that never fully masked the sting of exclusion, a quiet promise formed inside her. One day, she wouldn't just be allowed on the stage, she would command it. Her journey toward that promise was only beginning. When Dorothy Dandridge arrived in Hollywood in the early 1940s, she carried with her the confidence of someone who had spent years proving herself on the toughest stages in America. She knew how to own a room, how to let a quiet smile speak louder than a monologue, how to turn the smallest gesture into something unforgettable. But Hollywood was not waiting with open arms. It was a town built on dreams and guarded by rules that kept women like Dorothy far from the center of its spotlight. Her first roles were small, fleeting, and painfully predictable. She was cast as the exotic beauty, the island girl, the dancer, the mysterious stranger who drifted into a scene, offered a spark of allure, and vanished before the plot moved on. These roles required charm, grace, and often a smile, but never depth, never vulnerability, never a fully realized life. Dorothy, who had known struggle and complexity from the moment she could walk, found herself placed inside tiny boxes created by the industry's narrow expectations. But she played every role with intention. Even in 2-minute appearances, she insisted on delivering something real. Hollywood noticed, then ignored, then noticed again. She was too striking to overlook and too talented to dismiss, yet the system wasn't designed to let her ascend. Dorothy lived in a strange limbo, always admired, rarely advanced. Everything changed in 1954. When she auditioned for Carmen Jones, the all-black musical film adaptation of Bizet's opera, the room shifted. The confidence she brought wasn't loud. It was precise, dangerous, intoxicating. She embodied Carmen not as a stereotype, but as a woman of fire and contradictions. Otto Preminger, the film's director, saw what so many others had refused to see: a leading lady. Dorothy won the role, but even then, the industry's limitations trailed behind her. Studio executives doubted whether audiences were ready for a black woman in a fully dramatic starring role. They refused to let her sing with her own voice, replacing her vocals with those of an opera singer. It was an insult wrapped in caution, another reminder that even in triumph, control was rarely hers. Yet, when Carmen Jones premiered, the entire narrative changed. Dorothy didn't just perform, she detonated. Her presence electrified the screen. Critics were captivated, audiences enchanted. For the first time, Hollywood had to acknowledge what had always been true. Dorothy Dandridge wasn't merely beautiful, she was extraordinary. Her performance earned her a groundbreaking nomination for Best Actress at the Academy Awards, making her the first black woman in history to stand among the industry's elite in that category. It was a victory that resonated far beyond Hollywood. For countless people who had never seen themselves reflected in major film roles, Dorothy's nomination was a crack in the wall, a moment that suggested change was possible. But while the world applauded, the industry hesitated. Studio heads weren't willing to cast her opposite white male leads, and many scripts offered to her relied on outdated stereotypes she refused to reinforce. She turned down roles that demeaned black women. She refused to be complicit in her own diminishment. This integrity cost her dearly. Hollywood, threatened by her ambition and unsure how to handle her success, began to retreat. Offers shrank. Meetings grew colder. Dorothy found herself in the painful position of being celebrated publicly while excluded privately. It was the beginning of a pattern she would confront again and again. Every triumph illuminated the path ahead, but every barrier reminded her that the spotlight was never fully hers to keep. Her greatest victory had made history, yet it also revealed the limits of an industry still unprepared to let her soar. For a moment, it looked as if Dorothy's life was finally aligning with her dreams. Her rising fame, her beauty, her talent, everything suggested that the next chapter would be brighter. But life, for Dorothy Dandridge, rarely moved in a straight line. Beneath the glow of her success, there were fractures no camera could capture, cracks that began early and grew more painful with time. Her marriage to Harold Nicholas, one half of the legendary Nicholas brothers, began with passion and promise. Harold was charismatic, gifted, adored by audiences, an entertainer who understood the demands of the stage as deeply as she did. But the reality of their marriage was far from the glamorous fantasy the public imagined. Harold's constant touring, infidelity, and absence left Dorothy feeling abandoned in her own home. The one place where she hoped to find safety became another space of uncertainty. Then came the moment that changed her life forever. In 1943, Dorothy gave birth to her daughter, Harolyn Suzanne. During the birth, complications deprived the baby of oxygen, leaving Harolyn with severe developmental challenges. Doctors explained that she would need lifelong care, an announcement that broke Dorothy's heart and reshaped her future in an instant. Dorothy adored her daughter with a depth few ever understood. She poured her love into every moment, carrying guilt she did not deserve, believing somehow she should have been able to protect her child from a cruel twist of fate. At the same time, she was faced with the overwhelming reality of raising a child who required constant medical support, therapy, and supervision. The costs were staggering, and Hollywood, with its fickle loyalties and unpredictable paychecks, offered no guarantees. Dorothy worked relentlessly to provide for Harolyn. She accepted singing gigs in hotels, clubs, and lounges, even after long film shoots, anything to make sure her daughter would never go without what she needed. But each new job meant time away from Harolyn, and every moment apart carved deeper into Dorothy's heart. She lived suspended between two worlds, the fierce mother driven by love and the performer driven by necessity. The emotional toll was immense. Friends recalled watching Dorothy rehearse until her voice cracked, her eyes glistening not just with exhaustion, but with the ache of a woman who felt she was failing in every direction, no matter how hard she pushed herself. She carried the weight silently, always poised, always composed, determined never to let the world see her unravel. The collapse of her marriage only intensified this isolation. Harold drifted further away until the relationship finally dissolved. Dorothy was left standing in the middle of two storms, the one inside her home and the one outside it, in an industry that offered applause but no real support. Yet even in the midst of this heartbreak, Dorothy did what she had always done. She rose. She returned to the studio lots, the nightclub stages, the audition rooms, carrying her private pain with quiet strength. She rarely spoke about her struggles publicly, never seeking pity, never revealing how much she sacrificed each day. Her daughter's laughter could bring her back from the edge. A simple gesture, a small hand reaching for hers, a soft sound of trust would remind Dorothy why she fought so fiercely. Harolyn was her anchor, the most profound love of her life, the reason she refused to give up even when exhaustion wrapped around her like a shadow. But love, no matter how powerful, could not shield Dorothy from the harsh realities pressing in. Hollywood demanded glamour. Reality demanded sacrifice. And Dorothy, caught between the two, was beginning to bend under the weight. The world saw the radiant star. Only a few ever saw the mother holding her life together with trembling hands. After Carmen Jones catapulted Dorothy into history, she stood at a crossroads filled with hope, fear, and longing. She knew she had proven her talent. She knew she belonged in leading roles, and she believed, perhaps more than ever, that someone influential might finally see her as the star she truly was. That someone appeared in the form of Otto Preminger, the formidable director whose vision guided Carmen Jones and whose attention gradually shifted from professional admiration to something far more personal. Preminger was brilliant, commanding, and known for shaping careers with a firm hand. To Dorothy, he represented possibility. A man who recognized her artistry without hesitation, a respected figure who dared to cast her not as a stereotype, but as a woman of passion and complexity. Their relationship began privately, quietly, almost inevitably. Two strong, ambitious individuals bound by artistic chemistry and mutual attraction. But the glamour of their bond hid an imbalance Dorothy did not fully see at first. Preminger's influence was seductive. He offered guidance, promised opportunities, and spoke of future projects where she could shine even brighter. She trusted him, perhaps more than she had trusted anyone in Hollywood. Yet his guidance often came in the shape of limitations disguised as protection. He discouraged her from accepting roles he deemed unworthy. He insisted she wait for something greater, even when the industry's doors were already tightening around her. One by one, roles slipped away. Scripts she might have elevated were dismissed. Casting directors who admired her talent were turned aside by Preminger's quiet warnings or controlling presence. Dorothy, used to fighting for every inch of space in Hollywood, began fighting less. She believed him when he said better things were coming. She wanted to believe. For a time, hope felt easier than resistance. But Hollywood did not wait. Studios, already wary of casting a black leading actress, interpreted Dorothy's unavailability as disinterest or difficulty. Opportunities evaporated. The momentum from her Oscar nomination, so hard-earned, so fragile, faded in the shadow of choices she hadn't fully realized she was making. The emotional cost was even deeper than the professional one. Preminger's life was not built for permanence with her. Their relationship existed behind closed doors, hidden from an industry that would never accept them publicly. Dorothy found herself in a familiar position, cherished in private, constrained in public. The secrecy weighed on her. The power dynamic grew sharper. And slowly, painfully, she began to see that the man who once seemed like a lifeline might have also been tightening the circle around her. When the relationship finally ended, it did not explode. It thinned, frayed, then disappeared, leaving a hollow space where so much trust had lived. Dorothy had given her heart and her faith, and in return, she was left standing alone in an industry colder than ever. Without Preminger's influence, the roles did not return. Without his presence, the promises dissolved. She found herself facing the brutal truth. While she had been waiting for the future he described, Hollywood had quietly moved on. She was still breathtaking, still talented, still capable of carrying a film, yet the studios no longer looked her way. The fracture was not sudden. It was slow, corrosive, like a spotlight dimming without anyone noticing. Dorothy was left with the realization that love and opportunity had become intertwined in ways that cost her dearly. Her heart had led her into a place where her career could no longer breathe. And now, as she stood in the twilight of this chapter, Without the man she trusted, without the roles she deserved, Dorothy faced a world that seemed to shrink around her, as if the walls of Hollywood were quietly closing in. By the early 1960s, Dorothy Dandridge stood in a place she had never imagined for herself. The applause had softened, the phone rang less often, and the industry that once praised her brilliance now treated her like a relic from a moment it preferred to forget. Hollywood had always been fickle, but for Dorothy, the shift felt sharper. She had climbed a mountain no one thought she could reach, only to discover that the summit was narrower, lonelier, and colder than she expected. Financially, the pressure became relentless. Poor management decisions, combined with deceptive practices from people she once trusted, left Dorothy with mounting debts. The situation worsened when the IRS seized her home, one of the few places where she had ever felt a sense of ownership and stability. Losing it was more than a financial blow. It was an emotional one, a reminder that even the security she fought so hard to build could vanish in an instant. Work, once her refuge, no longer offered steady comfort. Roles were scarce. Hollywood had moved into a new era with new stars, leaving Dorothy suspended in an in-between space. Too iconic to be forgotten, yet too boxed in by the industry's old prejudices to be welcomed back with open arms. She accepted nightclub engagements, small clubs, mid-range lounges, rooms filled with murmured conversations and clinking glasses, instead of the roaring applause she once commanded. She performed with dignity, with fire, with remnants of the grace that had made her unforgettable. But behind the polish was exhaustion that deepened year after year. And still, she endured. Las Vegas became one of the harshest reminders of the contradictions she faced. She would step onto those dazzling stages, delivering performances full of charm and precision, only to be confronted by the discriminatory rules that trailed behind her everywhere she went. The humiliation she once experienced, the hotel draining its pool after she merely touched the water, lingered in her memory like a wound that never fully healed. It wasn't just a moment of prejudice. It was a symbol of how the world insisted on placing limits around her, no matter how brightly she shined. Behind the scenes, her personal battles continued. She loved her daughter Carolyn deeply and visited her as often as she could, holding on to every smile and small gesture. But providing consistent, long-term care required resources Dorothy no longer had. The weight of that reality, of wanting to give more, do more, be more for her child, rested heavily on her. She carried that burden quietly, with a tenderness that rarely made its way into public view. The demands of work, stress, and emotional fatigue influenced her health. Long tours, late-night performances, travel, and constant worry chipped away at her strength. She relied on rest aids to sleep, a common practice among entertainers of the era. But as the pressures in her life grew, she struggled to find balance, moving through her days with a kind of weary determination familiar to anyone who has fought too hard for too long. By 1965, the strain of it all, financial, emotional, and physical, became increasingly visible. Those close to her spoke of a woman who was still elegant, still composed, still luminous in her own quiet way, but undeniably tired. She had spent decades pushing against barriers that never fully yielded. Even strength has its limits. On September 8, 1965, Dorothy passed away unexpectedly at the age of 42. Her death, attributed to a reaction involving prescribed sleep aids, cast a shadow of sorrow across the entertainment world. There was no spectacle, no dramatic ending, only a quiet departure that left behind questions, grief, and the sense that Hollywood had lost a treasure it never fully understood. Her final years were marked not by failure, but by endurance. She held on to her dignity, her artistry, and her love for her daughter until the very end. And though her light faded too soon, it never truly dimmed. In many ways, Dorothy's final chapter wasn't about decline. It was about the endurance of a woman who kept standing even when the world around her did not stand for her. In the quiet after her passing, something remarkable happened. Hollywood, an industry that had once struggled to see Dorothy Dandridge clearly, finally paused long enough to realize what it had lost. The headlines spoke of tragedy, but the artists, dreamers, and young performers who followed in her footsteps understood that her story was not one of failure. It was one of extraordinary resilience, of a woman who dared to demand more from a world that offered her so little. Dorothy's life became a mirror reflecting both the beauty and the brutality of her era. She had opened a door that many insisted should stay shut, and she walked through it with grace, talent, and an unshakable presence. Even when the industry refused to evolve alongside her, she continued to move forward, carving a path for others who would one day rise without needing to ask permission. In the years after her death, her influence only grew stronger. Actresses and singers spoke her name with reverence, acknowledging the battle she fought so they wouldn't have to. When Halle Berry portrayed Dorothy decades later and won an Emmy for the role, she thanked her for paving the way, for proving that a woman of color could command the screen with depth, fire, and leading lady brilliance. Dorothy's legacy lived on not through the roles she was denied, but through the doors she forced open. Her story endures because it is more than a Hollywood tale. It is a human one. It reminds us that true greatness is not measured by the opportunities given, but by the courage to keep moving in their absence. Dorothy Dandridge's light did not fade. It transformed, becoming something timeless, something that continues to guide every artist who believes that beauty and strength can thrive even in the harshest places. Her journey was brief. Her impact was eternal.